I always believed water tells the truth about land, and the morning those sirens started echoing across Willowbrook Valley, the truth finally began to rise. I was standing on top of my grandfather's old earth dam when the first HOA president's golf cart screeched to a stop in the gravel below. The smell of wet clay and cedar hung in the cool Texas air, and down in the valley 35 brand-new houses sat in perfect suburban rows, their white fences and fresh sod glowing in the early sunlight like something straight out of a real estate brochure. Only one problem: houses. Two-story brick facades. Fresh asphalt streets curling through what used to be my family's land. The air smelled like diesel exhaust and hot tar instead of cedar and rain. I remember the exact moment I realized what had happened. My boots crunched over broken gravel as I walked past a shiny wooden sign planted right in the soil my grandfather once plowed. Willowbrook Estates Private Community. Established 2023. That's when I met Margaret Thornwell. Valley for years, and because the property management company handling our taxes had failed to respond to several notices, the land had been rezoned for residential development and incorporated into the subdivision. 35 houses, paved streets, underground utilities, and a clubhouse foundation already staked out near the creek. I remember the sound of nail guns echoing from the construction crews further down the slope and the faint hiss of irrigation sprinklers watering brand new lawns that had been planted where bluebonnets used to grow every spring. My grandfather would have stared at that scene in disbelief. That land was never empty. Valley now belonged to the Homeowners Association she proudly managed. What she did not realize was that while she had studied zoning maps and property records, she had never bothered to understand the quiet infrastructure that shaped the land itself. She did not notice the way the creek curved toward the dam. Floods. Standing there now, I could see that several of the new homes sat directly inside that old floodplain. Their foundations were raised slightly, probably to meet basic building codes, but the layout ignored the wider drainage path that had existed long before the first blueprint for Willowbrook Estates was ever printed. I crouched beside the creek and ran my hand through the cool water. The temperature and flow felt exactly the same as I remembered, steady and calm under the morning sun. Above me on the ridge, the dam held back several million gallons of stored rainwater collected over the last few seasons. That water was not dangerous. It was controlled, balanced carefully through a system my grandfather had designed with federal guidance nearly 50 years earlier. But the key word was controlled. Water management works only when the people downstream understand how the system functions. As I walked back toward my truck, I noticed a bright yellow survey flag planted beside one of the new driveways. It marked a storm drainage pipe the developers had installed to carry runoff beneath the street. The pipe pointed directly toward the creek channel, which meant every roof gutter and driveway in Willowbrook Estates now drained into the same natural path that had always fed the valley basin. The moment I saw that pipe, a quiet realization settled into my mind. Margaret Thornwell had built her perfect suburban neighborhood exactly where the land expected water to go. The houses were new, the streets were polished, and the HOA rules probably covered everything from mailbox colors to lawn height. But none of those rules could rewrite the basic shape of the valley. And none of them could change what happened when the reservoir upstream followed the same engineering logic it had followed since 1978. I drove straight to the county records office the next morning because land disputes are never won in the dirt first. They are won in filing cabinets that smell like old paper and dust. The courthouse sat on the edge of town, a limestone building that had probably watched 100 arguments about fences, wells, and property lines long before Willowbrook Estates ever existed. Inside, the air was cool and quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the slow shuffle of clerks moving between shelves of thick record books. I walked up to the counter and gave the clerk the parcel number from my grandfather's old tax documents. She typed it into her computer and turned the screen slightly so I could see the updated zoning record. Agricultural land converted to residential development. Willowbrook Estates Phase 1. 35 residential lots approved under a fast-track zoning changed the previous year. On paper it looked clean and official. But the more I read, the more something felt off. The development paperwork listed drainage compliance and stormwater mitigation approvals, yet the diagrams barely mentioned the reservoir upstream. That reservoir was not a decorative pond. It was an engineered structure with controlled water storage and release. Any subdivision built downstream should have referenced it clearly. I asked the clerk if she had older property records for the same land. She nodded and disappeared into a storage room behind the counter. A few minutes later, she returned with a faded file folder that looked older than the subdivision itself. The moment I opened it, I recognized my grandfather's name typed across a permit application dated 1978. Earth dam construction permit reviewed with consultation from the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The paper had yellowed with age, but the language was still clear. The dam had been built not just for cattle water, but for seasonal flood control along the creek basin that ran through our valley. Attached to the permit was a survey map showing the exact drainage pattern of the valley bowl and the downstream flood spread area that my grandfather had intentionally left undeveloped. I studied the lines carefully and felt the same quiet certainty settling in that I used to feel when solving a complicated engineering diagram. The subdivision map from Willowbrook Estates placed several streets and houses directly inside that old flood spread zone. The developers had treated the land like flat real estate instead of part of a water management system. I turned another page and found something even more interesting. A recorded water rights deed from 1923, purchased by my great-grandfather long before the dam existed. The document granted priority water control rights over the creek that fed the reservoir and the surrounding watershed feeding into it. In simple terms, it meant our family did not just own land. We owned legal authority over how water from that creek could be stored and released on the property where the dam sat. I leaned back in the wooden chair and listened to the quiet echo of footsteps across the courthouse floor while the realization fully formed in my mind. Margaret Thornwell believed zoning paperwork gave her complete control of the valley. The developers believed their storm drains and paved streets had solved the water problem. But the truth was sitting right there in my hands on paper older than every single house in Willowbrook Estates. The valley had never been designed for neighborhoods. It had been designed to manage water. And the one structure that controlled how that water moved was still standing exactly where my grandfather built it on the ridge above their brand new community. The courthouse papers rode beside me on the passenger seat all the way back to the valley, the old folder sliding slightly each time my truck rolled over a patch of rough pavement. The late afternoon sun hung low over the hills, turning the fields gold the way they used to look when my grandfather and I drove the fence lines checking cattle. As I turned onto the gravel road leading toward the dam, the smell of dust and dry grass drifted through the open window, and for a moment everything felt familiar again, like the land itself had been waiting for someone who understood what it really was. At the top of the ridge, the reservoir spread out behind the earth dam exactly the way I remembered it. Calm water reflecting the sky, framed by cedar trees and limestone banks that had not moved an inch in decades. My grandfather built that dam to last, and standing there now I could almost hear his slow, steady voice explaining how water moves through a valley, whether people notice it or not. I parked near the spillway gate and walked along the packed clay crest, the surface still firm under my boots even after years of weather. The engineering was simple but precise. A reinforced spillway channel on the east side allowed controlled water release during heavy rainfall, while the main gate system regulated how much water flowed back into the creek downstream. That gate had been opened and closed thousands of times over the years, always slowly and always with purpose. I leaned against the metal control wheel and looked out over the valley below. From this height, Willowbrook Estates looked almost peaceful. 35 houses lined along curved streets, their rooftops catching the fading sunlight. Lawn sprinklers clicked on across several yards, sending thin arcs of water across perfectly trimmed grass. It looked like a picture from a real estate brochure promising quiet suburban life just outside Austin. But I could also see the shape of the land beneath those houses, the shallow bowl where seasonal floodwater used to spread during spring storms. The developers had paved streets and poured concrete foundations, but the valley itself had not changed its shape. Gravity still pointed toward the same basin it always had. I opened the courthouse folder again and studied the documents resting on the hood of my truck. The 1923 water rights deed. The 1978 dam permit with federal consultation. The survey showing the natural flood distribution zone across the valley floor. All of it lined up with what my eyes already knew from growing up here. Willowbrook Estates had been built inside a system designed decades earlier to move and manage water. That did not mean the houses would collapse or the neighborhood would disappear overnight. It meant something far simpler and far more uncomfortable for the people living there. The land itself still followed the same rules it always had. I closed the folder slowly and listened to the faint sound of traffic from the new subdivision road below. Somewhere down there, Margaret Thornwell was probably organizing HOA meetings and sending friendly reminder emails about lawn maintenance and mailbox paint colors. She believed the valley now operated under her community guidelines. But up on the ridge, the reservoir waited quietly behind a dam that had been engineered long before Willowbrook Estates existed. And the paperwork in my hands made one thing very clear. When the time came to manage the water moving through this valley, the decision did not belong to the homeowners association. It belonged to the person standing beside the gate on top of the dam. I slept very little that night because once you understand how a system works, you cannot unsee the pattern. The quiet hum of crickets outside the farmhouse mixed with the distant sound of cars driving through Willowbrook Estates. And each time a pair of headlights passed along the subdivision road, I pictured the valley the way it used to look before the developers arrived, with their blueprints and bulldozers. Around sunrise, I brewed a pot of strong coffee and spread the courthouse documents across the old wooden kitchen table my grandfather built with his own hands. The early light coming through the window illuminated every line on those pages like a blueprint of the valley itself. The 1923 water rights deed. The 1978 dam permit with federal consultation. The watershed map showing exactly how rainfall collected along the ridge and flowed down toward the basin where Willowbrook Estates now stood. It was all there in simple black ink on aging paper. The law had not forgotten how this land worked, even if the developers had. After breakfast, I drove back up to the dam with a toolbox in the bed of my truck and the documents secured inside a weatherproof folder. The air smelled like cedar and limestone dust as the sun warmed the ridge. Standing beside the spillway gate, I inspected the control wheel and the old measurement markers along the concrete channel. Everything was exactly the way my grandfather left it, solid and functional, built to manage the kind of seasonal storms that roll across Texas hill country every spring. I knelt beside the metal housing that protected the gate mechanism and wiped away a thin layer of dust, revealing the manufacturer plate stamped with a date from the late 1970s. The engineering was straightforward. When reservoir levels rose beyond the designed threshold, the gate could be opened gradually to release water through the spillway channel into the creek basin below. The process was routine dam maintenance, the same kind of controlled release conducted by water managers across the state whenever reservoirs reached their capacity after heavy rain. The key detail sat quietly inside the permit paperwork folded in my truck. According to the federal consultation record, the owner of the dam maintained the authority to conduct periodic flow tests to confirm that the spillway and downstream drainage remained clear and functional. It was not dramatic. It was simply responsible water management. I stood on the crest of the dam and looked down toward the subdivision again. Morning sunlight bounced off windshields parked in neat driveways while delivery trucks rolled through the neighborhood streets dropping off packages and construction materials for the last few homes still being finished. People walked their dogs along the sidewalks, completely unaware that the valley beneath their neighborhood had been designed decades earlier as part of a water control system. I unfolded the watershed map once more and studied the blue lines tracing the natural drainage path from the reservoir to the basin below. Every storm drain pipe the developers installed now fed into that same channel. Every rooftop gutter and driveway carried runoff toward the valley bowl where spring floodwater used to spread across open pasture. The houses had replaced grass and cattle, but gravity had not changed its mind about where water wanted to go. I folded the map carefully and slid it back into the folder. The situation no longer felt complicated. Margaret Thornwell had relied on zoning paperwork and legal technicalities to claim the valley. The developers had relied on engineering shortcuts and storm drain pipes to make their subdivision appear safe. But the reservoir above them still followed the original design my grandfather built nearly 50 years earlier. And as the legal owner responsible for maintaining that dam, I had every right to make sure the system still worked exactly the way it was supposed to. I waited 3 days before doing anything, because good engineering decisions are never rushed. The weather forecast showed a slow-moving storm system building west of the hill country, The kind of wide gray front that drifts across Texas, bringing steady rain for hours instead of one violent downpour. By Thursday afternoon, the sky had turned the color of brushed steel, and the air carried that heavy scent of wet earth that always arrives just before the first drops fall. I drove up to the dam again with the paperwork folder on the passenger seat and a thermos of coffee beside it. From the ridge, I could already see rain falling across the far hills in long silver curtains. The reservoir behind the dam was higher than usual from the early spring storms, the waterline creeping close to the upper measurement markers along the clay embankment. That was exactly what the system had been built for. When rainfall filled the basin beyond its normal storage level, the dam operator performed a controlled spillway test to release water safely and confirm that downstream drainage remained clear. It was a procedure written directly into the permit documents from 1978. I stepped out of the truck and listened to the first soft drops of rain tapping against the metal hood. Down in the valley, Willowbrook Estates looked peaceful as ever. Porch lights flickered on in a few houses as the sky darkened, and a couple of residents hurried inside carrying grocery bags before the rain grew heavier. From this distance, the neighborhood looked like a perfectly planned community sitting quietly in the Texas countryside. But I could also see the long, shallow basin stretching beneath the houses, the same natural bowl my grandfather had studied when he first built the dam. The rain intensified quickly, drumming against the reservoir surface and sending ripples across the water like thousands of tiny footsteps. Within an hour, the reservoir level had climbed another few inches. The creek feeding into it was already running faster, carrying muddy runoff from the hills above the valley. I checked the level gauge again and compared it to the safety threshold listed in the maintenance manual stored in my truck. Everything was still within the normal operating range, but the approaching storm meant the system would soon need to release some of that stored water downstream to maintain proper balance. I unfolded the permit paperwork one more time and read the section describing authorized spillway testing during elevated reservoir conditions. The language was plain and direct. The dam owner retained full authority to conduct controlled water releases to verify the functionality of downstream channels and flood dispersion zones. In other words, it was my responsibility to make sure the valley drainage system still worked exactly the way it had been designed decades earlier. I walked slowly across the crest of the dam toward the spillway control wheel, rainwater soaking into the clay beneath my boots. The metal mechanism was cold and solid in my hands as I inspected the locking bracket and pressure indicators. Below me, the creek channel disappeared into the valley where Willowbrook Estates now stood. Streetlights had come on along the subdivision roads, glowing faintly through the curtain of rain. Residents probably believed the storm was just another spring shower moving through central Texas. None of them had reason to think about the reservoir sitting quietly above their neighborhood. I placed the folder of documents back inside the truck cab and returned to the spillway gate. The storm clouds rolled slowly overhead, while thunder rumbled somewhere far across the hills. The valley had always depended on careful water management to remain stable through storms like this. And standing there beside the gate with rain falling steadily around me, I realized that after all the zoning changes and construction permits and homeowners association meetings, the original system my grandfather built was about to remind everyone exactly how the land beneath Willowbrook Valley actually worked. The rain continued through the evening like a steady drumbeat across the reservoir, and by the time darkness settled over the valley, the water level had climbed another several inches along the measurement markers. I stood beside the spillway gate watching the surface of the reservoir ripple under the falling rain, while the creek feeding into it ran louder with every passing minute. This was exactly the situation the dam had been designed for. Water gathering slowly from the surrounding hills, filling the basin behind the earth wall until controlled release became necessary to maintain balance in the watershed. I checked the level gauge one more time with the flashlight from my truck. The reservoir had reached the threshold where a routine spillway test would normally begin during heavy seasonal rainfall. Down in the valley, the lights of Willowbrook Estates glowed through the rain like a small constellation scattered across the basin floor. Cars moved along the subdivision streets, headlights reflecting off wet asphalt, while porch lights illuminated front yards that had been freshly landscaped only weeks earlier. Everything looked calm from this height. Quiet suburban life unfolding beneath a storm that most residents probably considered ordinary Texas weather. I walked back to the spillway control wheel and rested both hands on the cold metal surface. The mechanism had not changed in decades. A slow turn of the wheel would raise the gate gradually, allowing a controlled flow of water to pass through the reinforced spillway channel and return to the creek below. Nothing sudden, nothing destructive, just water following the path the valley had always provided. Thunder rolled softly somewhere beyond the hills while the rain intensified again, each drop adding to the reservoir behind the dam. I turned the wheel slowly, feeling the resistance of the gate mechanism as it began to move for the first time in months. Metal groaned quietly as the gate lifted several inches and the first sheet of water slid through the spillway channel. The sound was deep and steady, like a river clearing its throat after being silent too long. Down below, the creek began to swell as the controlled release joined the rainwater already flowing through the basin. I leaned against the railing and watched the water travel down the familiar drainage path carved into the valley long before Willowbrook Estates existed. Within minutes, the creek widened across the low ground where my grandfather had always warned me not to build anything permanent. Rainwater from rooftops and streets in the subdivision began feeding into the storm drains the developers had installed, sending additional runoff into the same natural channel. The valley bowl slowly filled with shallow moving water exactly the way it had every spring when the pastures still held cattle instead of houses. Streetlights reflected off the spreading water while cars slowed along the lower road where the drainage basin crossed beneath the pavement. From the ridge, it was easy to see the full pattern. The reservoir releasing controlled flow through the spillway. The creek expanding into the floodplain that had always belonged to water long before any construction crews arrived. And the subdivision streets gradually turning into shallow reflective channels guiding rainwater toward the lowest part of the valley. Nothing about the process was chaotic. It was simply the valley doing what it had been designed to do. I adjusted the gate slightly to maintain a steady controlled release and watched the water continue its quiet journey downhill through the heart of Willowbrook Valley, following the same path it had followed for generations before anyone decided to build a neighborhood there. By the time the storm began to fade sometime after midnight, Willowbrook Valley looked very different than it had that morning. The rain slowed to a light drizzle tapping gently against the reservoir surface while the spillway continued releasing a steady controlled flow down into the basin below. I leaned against the railing on top of the dam and watched the valley through the soft glow of scattered streetlights. Water moved quietly across the low ground where the subdivision streets curved through the natural drainage path. It was not deep and it was not violent. It was simply the floodplain doing what floodplains have always done when steady rain meets gravity. The wide basin that once held grazing cattle now held a slow-moving sheet of stormwater reflecting porch lights and passing headlights like a mirror. Several cars crept cautiously along the higher roadways while the lowest intersections collected shallow pools of runoff that flowed gently toward the creek channel. From the ridge, the pattern was clear. The reservoir releasing water exactly within its design limits. The spillway channel guiding that flows safely toward the valley bowl. The storm drains from Willowbrook Estates feeding additional rainwater into the same basin the land had always reserved for it. I adjusted the gate slightly to maintain the proper release rate and watched as the water continued spreading calmly across the lowest yards of the subdivision before returning to the creek further downstream. Nothing about the process was chaotic. It was controlled water management functioning exactly the way the original engineering plan intended. By early morning, the rain had stopped entirely, and a pale sunrise began pushing through the thinning clouds over the hills. The reservoir level stabilized just below the upper markers, and the flow through the spillway slowed as runoff from the storm gradually decreased. Down in the valley, residents were already stepping outside their front doors looking at the shallow water that had briefly visited parts of their neighborhood overnight. A few people stood in driveways talking quietly, while city maintenance trucks rolled slowly through the streets checking storm drains and clearing small debris carried by the rain. It did not take long before Margaret Thornwell arrived near the lower road with a group of homeowners pointing toward the basin and discussing what had happened. From the ridge, I could see her white sport utility vehicle parked beside the sidewalk, while she spoke with animated gestures toward the creek and the drainage path running through the valley. Eventually, a county vehicle arrived as well. Two officials stepped out, and began examining the stormwater channels and the natural basin that had filled during the night. The same basin clearly marked on the watershed map sitting inside my truck. I closed the spillway gate gradually as the reservoir level returned to normal and the remaining water downstream began draining back into the creek. The valley slowly returned to its quiet morning routine, but the landscape had made something very clear to everyone living there. Willowbrook Estates had not been built on ordinary flat land. It had been built inside a system designed long ago to manage water moving through the hills. Margaret Thornwell believed property lines and homeowner association rules could redefine the valley, but the sunrise revealed the simple truth that had never changed. Land remembers where water belongs. And sometimes the quietest structure in a valley is the one that reminds everyone who actually controls how the landscape works.